August 30th, 2021. We're in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yod Het Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the bottom at the Mishnah. The Mishnah brings us in a different direction. We're no longer talking about Rosh Hashanah, about Yom Hadin, about Tishu B'Av being Korat, Gezar Din, or anything of that sort. We're now going to talk about establishing Rashi Hodashim. In other words, what we're going to talk about is Bizman Shebet HaMikdash Kayam, certainly some time ago, the way they would establish what day was the first day in the month, of course, was Kiddush HaChodesh Al Pi HaRe'iyah, based on what witnesses came and attested to. If they saw the new moon, that's how we'd establish what the first day of the month was. What do you mean? Could we have months that were 50 days or something of that sort if it was very cloudy? Certainly not. The max size of a month was 30 days. That's what we'd call a Chodesh Me'ubar. And then the lower size of a month would be 29 days. We'd call that a Chodesh Haser, which means to say, really all the witnesses were coming to attest to was that they saw the moon that would be significant on the night of the 29th. If they saw it then we know the last month was 29 days, and Rosh Chodesh would be the first day, in other words, would start on what we would envision as day 30. That's what once took place. When did we stop doing that? Not so simple. Harambam thinks that it was during the times of Abaye and Rava. Abaye and Rava is long after the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, but nonetheless we were in some way or fashion continuing this to their time, and then they really ceased any Kiddush al Pi HaRe'iyah. Harambam then goes on, based on his understanding of the Gemara, to say that when B'mei B'yameinu, the third Beit HaMikdash, is built, we will go back to Kiddush al Pi HaRe'iyah, which means that we have a full system in place. Nonetheless, he has it as a halacha. Moshe Misinai will go back to accepting witnesses and establishing based on their testimony, whereas the Rov Minyan Ubinyan Shel Rishonim don't understand it that way. They understand it in the simple sense. Hillel Hazaken was established the Luah HaChodashim the way we have it. That's the way we had it, and that's the way we'll have it. We follow Hillel, and we run with Hillel over Shammai. Indeed, going back to yesterday's class. Well, says the Mishnah, Al Shisha Chodashim Hashiluchin Yosi'in. You see, the problem is simple. If you're establishing the Rosh Chodesh based on the testimony, you now need to get that word out. Not only do you need to get that word out, it's very significant that you get the word out, not only within Eretz Yisrael, but outside of Eretz Yisrael. People need to know what the first day of the month is, specifically Rosh Hashanah time, but throughout the year, for 6 specific months, they would send messengers out, says Rashi, to the Gola, outside of Eretz Yisrael, in order to inform what the first day of the month was. Now, you had a few days on most months to get to the people, to tell them the first day of the month was on day 30, was on day 31. You needed to send out those messengers, because otherwise people would be making mistakes. The nation, the communities would be making mistakes as to the first day of Pesach, as to the first day, well, we'll see what days. Al Shisha Chodashim, so there were 6 specific months when they would dispatch messengers, Shiluchin Yosin Al Nisan Mipenei HaPesach. That one's quite clear. They would send out messengers so that by the 14th, the 15th of the month, everybody knew when it was Pesach, what was the real day of Pesach. In other words, they were maybe uncertain what the real Rosh Chodesh was. You didn't get word on that day if you were living far from the Mikdash, from the Sanhedrin, but you'd find out by Pesach. Al-Av mipnei hata'anit. Not only for Pesach, something that we envision as quite severe from the Torah. Pesach has the Isur of Hametz, has the Chova of Matzah, it's got lots of severities, but also for Av, Mipnei HaTa'anit, of course a reference to Tisha B'Av. So they would dispatch and they'd have less time. You'd only have 8 days to get there if you had Tisha B'Av. For Pesach, you had a little bit longer, of course, you had 14 days. They would not go on Shabbat in their messengership. So then you have to subtract a day from Tisha B'Av. They'd have to move quicker, and the places they didn't arrive at, what would they do? Well, we know what they would do generally speaking on Pesach, so you do 2 days of Yom Tov. What would you do if the messengers had not arrived, and it's either the 9th or the 10th, whatever, the day has come, the 9th, based on your calculation, has come. Now you're uncertain if this is the 9th, or if tomorrow is the 9th, if the last month was a Chodesh Haser, if the last month was a Chodesh Maleh. I'm living in Brooklyn, New York. I don't have easy access to technology to find out when they establish Rosh Chodesh. What am I supposed to do? Are you going to do 2 days of Ta'anit? The answer is no. But why not? and Rov HaTzibur Yicholim La'amod Bo. We're not able to do that. Maybe others can do Ramadan of some sort. We can't do 2 days of fast. We have hard enough time doing 1 day of fast. What they would do is just the second day was the fast. Only Asara, but that's the way the Rishonim say it. Only Asara Be'av would be followed. Asara Be'av, based on your calculations, just go with the 9th. Well, 2 reasons, if I'm not mistaken, given for that. Number 1, truthfully, the 10th was the day on which it really consumed by fire the Mikdash, and as a result, the 10th has, although we really follow it on the 9th, the 10th has the sorrow connected to it in a very poignant, real way. Secondly, you have something once in a while called Tisha B'Av Shenitha. It gets pushed off, which means to say, if you're not certain, so maybe I should do it on the day in which I know at the very least sometimes Tisha B'Av gets pushed off to. Anyway, the second of those months would be Av Mipnei HaTa'anid, because of Tisha B'Av, Al Elul Mipnei Rosh Hashanah, which is an interesting one, isn't it? Rosh Hashanah, of course, doesn't fall out in Elul. Rosh Hashanah falls out in Tishrei. It's the first day of Tishrei. Why would they go in Elul? Well, you can't go on Tishrei. How are you going to get there in time? People are not going to know when Rosh Hashanah, when the Rosh Chodesh was. So you dispatch from the month beforehand and tell them the establishment of the first day of Elul. What would that help them in terms of Rosh Hashanah? Says Rashi, in the majority of years, Elul was, in the vast majority of years, Elul was Haser, which means that you just counted to day 30. Okay, that's the majority of years, but furthermore, had you helped me with Elul, I'm going to end up anyway probably being somewhat uncertain. Says Rashi, by having Elul established, I know, count from there 30 days, and that day will be my Rosh Hashanah. That's the establishment of it according to Rashi. Tosafot disagrees. Tosafot, citing from Gemara and Masechet Beisa, says it's just not the way it was done. It says you did 2 Yamim Tovim for Rosh Hashanah. That's what Tosafot. If you take a look at the left-hand side, the bottom Tosafot says Tosafot. They say Modi'in Matay Mathil Elul ve'osin Rosh Hashanah biyom shloshim le'Elul. Right, bagola vigam lemachorato. Not only do you do the day 30 counting from the beginning of Elul, but the second day as well. He says kedemashma b'perek hamad be'etza perek bakol me'arvin shayu osin shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah misafek. Not only is there an establishment of this Yoma Arichta, as the Gemara discussed in Masech Besa, but there was also a safek of sorts. The question is, how would Rashi explain that Gemara? We could discuss it when we learn Masechet Betzah. But that's the Mahlok Rashi and Tosafot over here. Continues the Mishnah. Al Tishrei mipnei takanat hamoadot. But then, Al Tishrei, they would then come to explain, obviously after Rosh Hashanah, when the establishment of Tishrei truly was, because, you're then going to have Kippur, you're going to have Sukkot. You want to make certain that you're doing this right. It's true for Rosh Hashanah, I didn't have another option. I either needed to keep the 2 days, as Tosafot says, or I needed to accept it as the 30th day, as Rashi says. I didn't have time. You have to go based on the new moon, and the day of the holiday is on the day of the new moon. As a result, I didn't have a choice. But now that I'm getting into the month, I'm getting to the 10th day of the month, I'm getting to the 15th day of the month, I want those messengers dispatched. I want to know exactly when Tishrei began, and so as a result, you'd send for Tishrei as well. Al Kislev mipnei Hanukkah, and during the month of Kislev, in order to know when to begin Hanukkah, they would send those shluchim. What would happen if the messengers didn't come? You'd have an extra day of Hanukkah. Why don't we have that today? That'd be very nice. Kids would be happy. We'd have extra. It would be a little awkward. We would only have 8 candles burning, but 9 days of the holiday. Well, that's not the reason. As far as I know, the Rishonim, some of them say, is that this is a mitzvah. It's a holiday which is only midrabbanan. And as a result, since it's only rabbinic in nature, we don't have that safek humra of adding on another day. Tosafot, interestingly though, the second to last Tosafot points out, but we do it on Shavuot. And Shavuot, it's an unnecessary double holiday, because after all, they're not going to send messengers for Sivan. Why? They're not going to send messengers for Sivan in order to know when the 6th of Sivan is, when the Shavuot is. Says Tosafot, based on the Gemara and Daf Vav, we know that Shavuot is established based on the counting of the Omer. Sometimes, once upon a time, it wouldn't fall out on the 6th of Sivan when we didn't have an established calendar. As a result, it's unnecessary to send messengers. It was just going to go based on Sfirat HaOmer. And why do we keep 2 days of Yom Tov? I've been asked this question more than once. Jeffrey, you may have asked me this past year. So I think it may have been you. So why are we keeping 2 days of Shavuot? If the whole establishment of Shavuot, someone Either it was you or someone from your section in Avenue U. That's the whole establishment. So then what do we keep in 2 days? The whole point is because we're uncertain, but we are certain. We never even needed to send messengers. The answer is, it's a little bit of a letdown. We want to make it equivalent to Pesach. We want to make it equivalent to Sukkot. I know it sounds a little bit, for those who don't love too much holiday, a little harmful from the rabbis. But on the other hand, it gives a certain honor to the holiday. If you had every other holiday as 2 days Yom Tov and Shabuot didn't, it wouldn't feel all that, quote, real to people. Yes?
So there was only one set of witnesses for the entire Jewish people?
There was one set of witnesses upon whom we would determine the first day of the month. Yes.
The entire Jewish people?
The entire nation. Yes.
So you weren't like in one area and you just said, okay, our witnesses saw it and we're going to establish it?
No good. It needed to be established, accepted, vetted, and by Sanhedrin. Yes, indeed. Yeah, you saw it, doesn't matter. You needed to get word. Continues the Mishnah, Va'al Adar mipenei Purim. Same type of conversation on Purim. Why don't we have 2 days of Purim? Although there's an additional reason for why we don't have 2 days of Purim. Not only is it, at best midrabbanan, call it midivrei nevuah, divrei sofrim, but it's furthermore Purim. It says velo ya'avor. The pasuk says with regards to reading the Megillah, you read it on these days and nothing more. So the understanding is we don't add on to the days of reading Megillah, and therefore there's no 2 days of Purim today. Even if quote unquote, even though we practice safek on all the other holidays. Ukeshehaya Beit Hamikdash kayam. Yosein Av Al Iyar. When you had the Mikdash, they would go for an additional month. In addition to the ones we just mentioned, they would go for the month of Iyar. Why so? Mipnei Pesach HaKatan. Right? That's Pesach Katan, which is the 14th day of Chodesh Iyar. What's the 14th day of Chodesh Iyar? If you were Tameh or B'derech Rechoka, if you were incapable because you were honest on the first Pesach, it was out of your hand, and you weren't able to sacrifice and to consume the Korban Pesach, you had the next month, a month later, on the 14th of Iyar, to celebrate and to fulfill that. Of course, when you don't have the Beit HaMikdash, what do we do on Pesach Katan? We have a little bit of matzah, but we don't need shiluchim in order to eat a little bit of matzah, in order to be certain about the day. It's only bizman shebeit hamikdash kayam that we would send shiluchim in order to establish Pesach Katan. Says the Gemara, velepku name atamuz v'tevet. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. You're telling me that the second in your list of months that they would dispatch those messengers for, was Av, mipenei hata'anit. Well, why are we separating between Tisha B'Av and, let's call it for the moment, for today, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Asara B'Tevet? Those are also major fast days on our calendar. Why are they not mentioning the third day of Tishrei, what we call Som Gedalia? The answer is, once you're already practicing Rosh Hashanah, so then you're just going right after Rosh Hashanah to Som Gedalia, and furthermore, you didn't have an ability to really dispatch during Tishrei, as we mentioned, until later on. But anyway, that's the question in the Gemara. What's the difference between those two fast days, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Asara B'Tevet, and Tisha B'Av? Says the Gemara, I'll strengthen my question. I'll tell you, those are real fast days. Don't think we just made those up at some juncture. De Amar Rav Hana bar Bizna, Amar Bishimon Hasida, Mai Dichtiv. What does it mean when this pasuk in Zechariah says, Ko Amar Adonai Sevaot, Som HaRevi'i, V'Som HaChamishi, V'Som HaShevi'i, V'Som HaAsiri? It mentions 4 separate somot, fast days. Yihiyeh lebet Yehuda lesason u'simcha. So the statement is from the Navi Zechariah, these days, these fast days will be sason v'simcha, joyous, festive activity days. Well, I'm a little bit confused. Well, first and foremost, you mentioned 4 separate fast days. We already know what direction we're going in, and that's going to be the 4 fast days. But the pasuk on the one hand calls them fast days, and on the other hand it says they're going to be days of joyous activity and festivity. It's going to be sason and simcha. Kare lehu som. On the one hand, they're fast days. V'kare lehu sason v'simcha. And on the other hand, they're days of happiness, of rejoicing. The answer, of course, is Bizman sheyesh shalom yihiyu lesason u'simcha. En shalom som. The pasuk is predicting a future time. Says Zechariah, when there is no shalom, when there's difficulty on the home front. We'll have to define that word in a second, but for now there's no peace. That's when there's som. However, when there is shalom, when there is peace, that's when you'll have sason v'simcha. How do we define the word shalom? So the word shalom, before I get to your question, Sharon, important question, because Sharon said I didn't mention the word Beit HaMikdash once. These days are all about the Mikdash. Why are you talking about peace? Hold the question for a second. Just why is the Gemara mentioning this? Well, we know why the Gemara is mentioning this, right? The Gemara is mentioning this as part of a question. The question was, why are you only dispatching those messengers for the month of Av? Why aren't you as well for Tammuz and for Tevet? After all, those are real fast days. Bizman she'en shalom. Okay, now how do we define in shalom? So, and yesh shalom, take a look at the third line in Rashi. It says Rashi, sheyesh shalom, she'en yad ha'ovdei kochavim tekefa al Yisrael. The description, the definition of en shalom or yesh shalom is whether we have self-jurisdiction, whether we are in control of ourselves, or there's an outside government controlling us, or an external government controlling us. That's the definition. Well, you have to understand that, Sharon. As a result, someone like Harambam will tell you, when he writes this, that Bizman Shebet HaMikdash Haya Kayam, the second Bet HaMikdash, we were still fasting on some of these. What do you mean you're fasting on some of these days? So it has to be the interpretation, as they explain to Harambam, is Harambam says, during that time period, we didn't have self-jurisdiction at all times. Yad HaUmot was tekefa aleinu. So although we had the Mikdash, we were still not in full control. There were still dangers. We were still fasting. It's a jarring statement. It's following this type of interpretation of Rashi, that the definition of shalom is not contingent on Mikdash, right? It's above and beyond Mikdash, or it's side by side Mikdash. Rabbeinu Hananel on the right-hand side does define it as you said. Says Rabbeinu Hananel on the right-hand side, says, you want to know what shalom means? Shalom, in mine, it's the third line down. He says, kilomar, you want to know what it means? Shalom, kol zeman shebet HaMikdash kayam. In that circumstance, Yehiye lesason u'simcha. So indeed, according to Rabbeinu Hananel, we define shalom by Bizman Shebet HaMikdash Kayam. So Bizman Shebet HaMikdash Kayam, he would disagree with Harambam. When you had the second Bet HaMikdash, you didn't have any of these fast days, please. You had a fantastic time, or at the very least, a good time, a peaceful time, and as a result, you didn't have these fast days, and he's defining the word shalom in such a fashion. Okay, well that's what we have in our Gemara. How do you define the word sason and simcha? So of course I said to you, festivity, joyousness, happiness. Says Rashi, interestingly, the fourth line from the top, le'aser, to be asur, to be prohibited, behesped ubeta'anit. That you're not allowed to eulogize and you're not allowed to fast. Interestingly, for Rashi, it was never portrayed or meant to be understood as a time where you'll be actively participating in joyous activity. It's rather, you'd have to abstain from fasting and refrain from eulogizing, right? So when the Pasuk says, these days will be lesason u'simcha, don't get ahead of yourself. There were tragic days in the past. Don't think now we're going to start celebrating on that day. It's true. It's going to be a time during which we have serenity, and we won't fast, we won't eulogize, but it won't be particularly happy. Anyway, that's what we're stuck with in the Gemara. Why did they send the Shiluchim only for Av and not for Tammuz and Tevet? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Papa, Hacheka Amar. Rav Papa says you misunderstood the earlier statement. You have to understand it in more of a detailed and nuanced fashion. Bizman sheyesh shalom, yihiyu lesason u'simcha. Okay, it's true when, and take your choice over here, you either have Mikdash or you have self-jurisdiction, define shalom accordingly. You'll have sason and simcha. Sason and simcha, according to Rashi, no fast, no eulogy. However, yesh gezerat malchut, som. What if you have neither shalom, you're not in control, and furthermore, there's gezerat malchut, there's decrees of persecution against the Am Yisrael in that time period, mandated som, absolute command to be fasting. So I have two extremes right now. One is I have self-jurisdiction, I have mikdash, defined accordingly, sason and simcha. Other end of the spectrum, again, is not just that I don't have mikdash, not just that I don't have self-jurisdiction, but rather there's gezerat malchut. Times are bad, they're out to get us. What about in the middle there? In the middle would be, I don't have self-jurisdiction, but they're not out to get me. He continues, it says, what if in gezerat malchut, there's no decrees against the Jews. Ve'in shalom, but I don't have the mikdash, or I don't have self-jurisdiction. What's the halacha then? What's that time period reminiscent of? You might consider that similar to our time period or our circumstance, certainly as dwellers in Galut. We have neither self-jurisdiction, we're under the American government, but on the other hand, we don't have Mikdash. On the other hand, we don't have Gezerat Malchut. I'd like to imagine our lives as such. Says the Gemara, what's the halakha in such a circumstance? Rasu mit'anin, rasu en mit'anin. These are very important words, very controversial words. The words are, during a time of galut, without persecution, without gezerat malchut, it's up to you and me to determine whether we want to do ta'anit or not. Are you kidding me? Seriously? Well, that's the statement in the Gemara. So Jeffrey says, why are you distinguishing, which is the next line in the Gemara, and I've been saying it very carefully, between Shav'asar b'Tammuz, Asara b'Tevet, and we'll throw in Som Gedalia and Shabbat. The Gemara will in a second say Shabbat is not getting lumped in here. Shabbat was Huchbelu Bosarot, Puranut, and so forth. So it always is maintained as a Yom Som. Okay, I still have a problem with this. I mean, what sort of statement is this? What are they telling us? They're telling us. So there are different approaches to this line in the Gemara. Shulchan Aruch, I'll really begin with that. Shulchan Aruch follows the most stringent opinion on this matter. The most stringent opinion on this matter is it's not up to you and me. It's up to communal acceptance. And guess what? For several thousand years, our national community has accepted these days as ta'anit, and as a result, it's got the full violation and severity connected to it. Is it Shabbat? We all know it's not Tisha B'Av, but the Rasu mit'anin, Rasu en mit'anin is not up to you and me. You can't just wake up one Shvat Sabbath Hamuz and say, hey, things are not so bad. It's true, I don't have Mikdash, but Rasu en mit'anin, it doesn't work that way any longer. Although there are Rishonim who did maintain that was a possibility. Interestingly, some of Chachmei Sefarad, Ritva, and others suggest that even during a time as such, which I'm telling you, we no longer have that ability to decide, there is a certain leniency which was inherent, which was manifested by this historical reality. What's that? Well, look at Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, we begin at night, and we have several inuyim which are asurim on the day. You're not allowed to wear leather shoes, you're not allowed to tashmish up, and so on and so forth, right? So there's rechitza, I should mention, right? You're not allowed to do those things, but you could do those things on Shiv'asar b'Tammuz, you could do Ra'asara b'Tevet. Why are you distinguishing? Says Ritva, say several others, say once upon a time you weren't allowed to. All fast days of these sort were identical. Once you no longer have Gezerat Malchut, once you have Rasu Mitanin, Rasu En Mitanin, it's true. Rasu Mitanin, we determined that we're going to accept this as Ta'anit, but it didn't come with all the severities that Shabbat maintained. Says the Gemara, let's just conclude with these words. If this is so, okay, had that answer the question before I go on? Well, it answers the question because it says these days are less severe and it was probably Lo Rasu. Well, that's the suggestion of the Gemara. The reason they weren't dispatching, the reason there wasn't a mandated shluchim on Tammuz and on Av is because it was up to the acceptance of the people. And the understanding in turn seems to be that during the time of the composition of the Mishnah, or historically speaking, it was Lo Rasu. They didn't need this during that time period. Alternatively, it was a time where the Mishnah is... You see, you can't argue our Mishnah is talking about Bizman Shebet HaMikdash Kayam, because the Mishnah concludes with Bizman Shebet HaMikdash Kayam, they would send for Iyara as well. So it appears as if there was some sort of in-between time period during which it was Lo Rasu. We weren't keeping these fasts, or we weren't steadfast on these fasts. Says the Gemara, if this is so, Tisha B'Av nameh, so then Tisha B'Av as well. Why are you sending Shluchim for Tisha B'Av? Why isn't it just like Av and Tammuz? They're all in the same pasuk. It's all the Sason and Simcha and Som, and you're telling me it's Rasu and Lo Rasu. Amar of Papa. Rav Papa quite succinctly and simply distinguishes Shaneh is different. Tisha B'Av ho'il v'huchpelu bo sarot. Tisha B'Av is a day on which the word kefil, of course, means doubled. We're going to mention more than just two. The sarot, the word sar means narrow, means difficulties. There are many sorrows that historically befell us on Tisha B'Av. De'amar mor, after all, we have this earlier statement, B'Tisha B'Av harav habayit barishona, destruction of the first Mikdash on Tisha B'Av, uba sheniya, and on the second Bet HaMikdash Mikdash on Tisha B'Av. V'nilkeda Betar. Betar was, after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, there was a stronghold. This is a long time after destruction. We thought that we were going to still reconquer Jerusalem and reestablish ourselves. This is during the time of Bar Kochva, if you've ever heard about that. Rabbi Akiva believed this individual was Mashiach. We were going to win. We had thousands of Jews gathered in a place called Beitar, and we thought we were going to win, and we were wiped out. We got destroyed. That's a terrible day. It's a day on which you thought you were going to have your uprising. You were going to rebuild or build up the Mikdash for once and for all, and it was lost. That's on Tisha B'Av. And lastly, we have this sort of tradition that Yerushalayim, the Ir, was nehresha. It got like plowed over. In other words, it lost any semblance of a city. It really got destroyed completely. You mentioned 4 sorrows. Says Tosafot, but Shiva'asar b'Tammuz, the Mishnah tells us, the Gemara Masechet Ta'anit says, 5 things happened on that day, right? We mentioned this on every Shiva'asar b'Tammuz. What happened on this day? We mentioned all sorts of things. Says Tosafot, but come on. Can't compare destruction of first and second Mikdash to any and all terrible things which happened on Shvas HaB'Tammuz. And as a result, we distinguish here in the Gemara, we distinguish in the Mishnah between Tisha B'Av, on which we don't say Rasu Mit'anin, Rasu Lo Mit'anin, and Shivas HaB'Tammuz and Asara B'Tevet, where we do have such a reality. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.